Hi everyone, my name is Rachel. This is Women in Priesthood. This is a channel where we've taken on President Russell M. Nelson's challenge in 2019 for us to study all we can about priesthood power. I have also taken a bit of time in my channel as well to kind of talk about signs of the times, the second coming. A lot of you know, some of you don't. My background is in Middle Eastern studies. I have an undergrad and a graduate degree in Middle Eastern studies. I also worked in Iraq for 3 years during the height of the war. I was at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad there. Came back and did my graduate studies research on population growth in the Middle East. And then I taught Middle Eastern studies at the Special Forces Warfare School. So I have a lot of background in the Middle East. I also am a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So my good friend and I, Jared from Christian Homestead, have tried to we've done a few collaborations in the Middle East, Islam, Muslims. I lived in Morocco as well for 4 months with a Muslim family in 2006. It's actually where I met my husband on a BYU study abroad. So I also have a lot of exposure to the Middle East. Right after college, I worked in like the Gulf region, the Emirates, Dubai, Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, all those places. So I have a lot of exposure to like different parts of the Middle East, different aspects of Islam. Having lived in an immersive environment in Islam, I've seen the different ways that Islam is expressed. And one of the interesting things about thinking about Christ's second coming, I think the cat's out of the bag with President Nelson mentioning the second coming and Jesus coming again 7 times in his last general conference talk. One of the things that I want to ask is, like, who will be here when Jesus comes? And one of the interesting things about looking at population growth is that you can look at the globe right now and look at current fertility rates and know where a large proportion of people are probably going to be in when Jesus comes again. I found this article that I'd always wanted to read to people and kind of begin to introduce members of the church to Islam, what the Islamic people believe in, how those things are remarkably aligned with the gospel of Jesus Christ and our history when it comes to the restoration. So we'll get into it in future videos, but starting from a baseline, I found this really interesting series of articles that give us some insights about what the millennium is going to be like when Jesus comes and we have this diverse array of people still on the earth, particularly Muslims. There's going to be a huge number of Muslims, and there already are a huge number of Muslims in the world, because they are the countries that have some of the highest population growth rates in the world and have for a while. And so I wanted to read with you some of these quotes that give us a lot of insight. They're from Brigham Young, from Joseph Fielding Smith, about what the millennium is going to look like and how that applies to people of other faiths. This should be illuminating. So, okay. During the millennium, people of all faiths and denominations will be on the earth. Those living a terrestrial life will be on the earth during the millennium. Many prophets have spoken about this idea that people of all faiths will be on the earth during the reign of the Savior Jesus Christ. Brigham Young said, "When all nations are so subdued to Jesus that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess, there will still be millions on the earth who will not believe in him, but they will be obliged to acknowledge his kindly government." That's from Discourses of Brigham Young, page 115. He also said, "In the millennium, men will have the privilege of their own belief, but they will not have the privilege of treating the name and character of deity as they have done heretofore. No, but every knee shall bow and every tongue confess to the glory of God the Father that Jesus is the Christ." Joseph Fielding Smith makes this really important statement that I honestly didn't understand maybe until I had studied Islam and I studied what other prophets had said, because I studied my undergrad at BYU. So there was a lot of really great education when it came to Islam and the way that we view their religion. So Joseph Fielding Smith said, "Some members of the church have an erroneous idea that when the millennium comes, all of the people are going to be swept off the earth except righteous members of the church. That is not so." I'm going to read that apart. I'm going to read that part again because it's pretty important. "Some members of the church have an erroneous idea that when the millennium comes, all of the people are going to be swept off the earth except righteous members of the church. That is not so. There will be millions of people, Catholics, Protestants, agnostics, Mohammedans is what he calls them. We should just say, I'm just going to say Muslims, people of all classes and of all beliefs still permitted to remain upon the face of the earth, but they will be those who have lived clean lives and those who have been free from wickedness and corruption, all who belong by virtue of their good lives to the terrestrial order, as well as those who have kept the celestial law, will remain upon the face of the earth during the millennium. Eventually, however, the knowledge of the Lord will cover the earth as the waters do the sea. But there will be need for preaching of the gospel after the millennium is brought in, until men are either converted or pass away. In the course of the 1,000 years, all men will come into the church or kingdom of God, or they will die and pass away. In that day, there will be no death until men are old. Children will not die, but will live to the age of a tree. Isaiah says this is 100 years. When the time comes for men to die, they will be changed in the twinkling of an eye, and there will be no graves. That's Doctrines of Salvation 186. There is so much to unpack in that last paragraph by Joseph Fielding Smith. Holy cow. So I think it's really important to understand that when Jesus comes, it will be, it won't just be members of the church. It won't just be righteous members of the church that are left. It will be people who have lived good lives or who have lived celestial lives. So I would assume that means that members of the church who have kept their celestial temple covenants, and then good people. What's interesting about Islam, I was having a discussion recently with a friend who deployed to the Middle East multiple times, and we were having discussions about it. As I said, that the Middle East and the Islamic world has some of the worst versions of inhumanity that you could ever imagine. Like the term in the Book of Mormon, past feeling. There are so many people who enact such horrific acts of violence on humanity that are in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, North Africa. I had to stop working this career because it was so horrifying to have to keep teaching and researching things by ISIS and the Taliban and Sunni Shia violence. It's just absolutely horrifying things that have happened. And then on the flip side, you also have an incredible world of good human beings who have managed to pull together lives largely in poverty. Most of the Middle East is impoverished and urban. Really good people who have remained remarkably family centric. That's one of the things that I think is so unique and special about Islam, is that they are, of the three Abrahamic religions, so there's three major religions that revere Father Abraham: Christians, Jews, and Muslims. And Muslims, I think, have done the best job of the three maintaining a loyalty to the Abrahamic covenant, meaning they have maintained a fixed loyalty to family posterity, to a family centeredness. When it's really funny is when my husband and I have gone to Qatar recently, we call it Muslim Utah, or it's more Dubai, Qatar, Bahrain, the wealthier Islamic countries, is we call it Muslim Utah because they're such family oriented places. There's kids with strollers, there's wealthy men and women with like 4 or 5 kids, but there's playgrounds, and it's just a very family oriented place to be. I don't think people appreciate that they are the one Abrahamic covenant people that have not had a population collapse. They've even done better than we have, and they have less of the gospel than we have. They do have the Abrahamic covenant. They do revere Father Abraham. Another interesting thing about Muslims is that in the Quran, which is it's almost like their New Testament. And I'm going to do deeper dives on Islam. If you have questions about Islam, especially from an LDS perspective, leave them below. I feel really called as a member of the church to prepare people for the second coming as it relates to how we can be prepared to help our Muslim brothers and sisters when the millennium happens. That means you need to know about them. You need to understand their perspective and what they believe. The Islamic people will be very prepared to recognize that Jesus is the Christ. In their holy book, Jesus is seen as a prophet, a very inspired prophet. He's not seen as the Son of God, but he is mentioned, if I can remember where I saw this, he is mentioned almost, 187 times and 108 times directly. And he's seen as a really inspired good man and a prophet. He is described as the Messiah, or Al-Masih in Arabic. And there's several other names. So he is seen with a lot of respect. But he's not seen as the Messiah. So I think it's important. So we're looking at this scripture. Some members of the church have an erroneous idea that when the millennium comes, all of the people are going to be swept off the earth except righteous members of the church. That is not so. There will be millions of people, Catholics, Protestants, agnostics, Muslims, and people of all classes and beliefs still permitted to remain upon the face of the earth. But they will be those who have lived clean lives, who have been free from wickedness and corruption. And that's going to be, given the fact that so much of the globe, so this is where I'm going to show you, this is where my background, I love population studies. This is where my background in population growth can help us, because it's like, who's going to be here when the millennium comes? Well, we can't know exactly. That's God's decision to decide, right? But we can kind of guess a little bit, because based on numbers, based on who is actually alive in the world right now, what proportion of the current Earth's population is comprised of people who live in the Middle East. This is a cartographic map, and this shows how countries, it basically weights by size. It's like an image-based way to depict the size of a country and how it's either decreasing or increasing. So I'm going to walk you over here in the United States. You can obviously see that the United States is shrinking in size, and so is Mexico. Looks like it's staying slightly the same, and Latin America is shrinking in certain parts except Brazil. But you come over here to North Africa, Africa's growing, and the Middle East is growing. Now, the only thing that I don't like about cartographic maps is that this obviously shows that China is huge, but we obviously know that China is headed towards a massive population collapse because they are so heavily weighted towards elderly people, and there's no young people being born. So in terms of total numbers, there's a huge number of the globe that's in India. And this area, India is not Muslim, but this country right over here is Pakistan and Afghanistan. Those are largely Islamic countries. Then over here in the Levant, in Turkey and Saudi and Iraq and Iran, those are all Islamic countries as well. Right here, this little blob right here, Egypt, huge population growth. It's an Islamic country. And then North Africa, this dark green over here, that's all an Islamic, even though it's in North Africa is predominantly Muslim. Obviously, West Africa over here is going to be a mix of Christian and Islamic. They're kind of intermingled a little bit. It's kind of it's like almost a religious transition zone. So when you look at the future, so that was a 2018 map. Let's go ahead and look at, I want to look at let's look at 2022 and see how things have shifted a little bit. And you can see based on this that I don't know if you can really completely tell. Let's see if they've got an even bigger one. Do we want to do, okay, well, let's do 2050 for the sake of argument. What you're going to see here, this is kind of what I like about cartographic maps, is they show you based on pictures where populations are going. And this shows you that over here in the United States and Canada and even Latin America, surprisingly enough, in the next 25 years, those parts of the world will shrink in total population. Those will be parts of the world that decrease in number of people alive. Whereas the Indian subcontinent, which is mostly made of Hindus, India is a mix of religions, but Over here to the west of India is Islamic. Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Iran are Islamic countries. And then you have over here the Levant. You have Turkey, Iraq, Syria, you have Saudi, you have the Gulf. Those countries are growing in population. Not aggressively growing as aggressively as Pakistan. Pakistan is a hugely growing, like that's where I did my graduate research at Dartmouth, is Pakistan's population growth. At one point they were having like 6 or 7 kids per woman. So their population growth, Egypt's population growth is huge. North Africa's population growth is big. Not as big as like Nigeria and West Africa. In the northern section of these West African countries, you have Muslim populations and a lot of really tragic violence happening in this northern part of, if you can see where my arrow is, it's like the northern parts of Nigeria and the Ivory Coast. You've got basically this coastal area down here is all Christian, and up here and then up to the Mediterranean is mostly Muslim. But this transition zone is where you see a lot of religious conflict between Muslims and Christians and a lot of violent Muslim activity. Okay, so that kind of gives you, so when you ask this question, like, who will be here in the millennium? I think it's kind of a logical way to say, there's going to be a lot of Muslims, just because there's a lot of Muslims on the earth proportional to every other religion. There's going to be a lot of Muslims here to meet Jesus Christ, and they are uniquely positioned by their religion to be able to recognize. I'm going to play for you this little video while this kind of shows, this shows kind of the spread of like where Islamic countries tend to be spreading, and North Africa and parts of Turkey, they had kind of parts of Southeast Asia. This is the general like map of where most of the Islamic world is. And when you look at this map, you can see how it corresponds completely opposite to where global temples are. So that's something I always pay attention to is, and proselyting and converting in the religion of Islam is haram. Once you are Muslim, you are always Muslim. You are not allowed to convert. And so where we see here is we see temples in the Ivory Coast, which is kind of close to the Islamic world. You see temples in Europe, and then you see a temple in India. But the exact spot where you do not see any kind of missionary work, proselyting, or anything is the exact Middle East. So that's something I'm always like paying attention to at conference. Like, are we going to get a temple somewhere close? It just means that because Muslims have so much mention of Jesus Christ, when he comes, they would be prepared to recognize him religiously. They are of the Abrahamic covenant. So there's an enormous amount of doctrine that they already do have, true doctrine that they do have. They are living up to a lot of those covenants of multiply and replenish. They're honestly doing a better job than we are, frankly. But there's no temple work being done in their part of the world. There's no missionary work. They have such minimal exposure to the gospel of Jesus, almost none. There's stories about being able to even meet. I lived in Dubai for a little while, and there is a ward there that's permitted to meet. But they have to basically pledge that there won't be any kind of proselyting happening. I wanted to give you a little bit of an intro. I've learned so much about priesthood power from an Islamic perspective because the Abrahamic covenant means so much to them. They revere Abraham, and the Hajj to Mecca is a pilgrimage that they make to honor Abraham. And this is just a short video, and I can post the link below if you want to learn about. It's one of the great highlights of every Muslim's life is if they can walk from Medina up north down to Mecca, and it's almost like it's when we do pioneer treks and we kind of relive the pioneer experience, and we walk where they walked, we are commemorating that journey. This is what Muslims do to commemorate Muhammad's trek from Medina to Mecca. And in Mecca, they were able to establish their own religious community and isolate themselves so that they could have kind of pure doctrine. They will circle this, the Kaaba, in honor of Father Abraham. So they very much venerate and respect Abraham. And they strive to really live up to that covenant, for lack of a better. No, that is the right word. This is a really worthwhile documentary. It's going to give you like real exposure to the things that they believe. Also, I had some friends who were able to get more exposure into a mosque when we were in Morocco. I hadn't received my endowments or gone through the temple at the time, so I didn't notice the parallels. But there are an enormous number of parallels to going into a mosque that you would see in the LDS temple ceremonies as well. And you'd also see them in Judaic rituals as well. So that's a really interesting thing that I think you'll find that a lot of things that will happen in the second coming and would be very familiar, would seem not abstract to the Islamic world, to Muslims in the Islamic world, because there are so many ritualistic things that they do that really line up with the things that we in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints do. Especially when it comes to worship. They believe in praying 7 times a day. They pay tithing. They go to the mosque, which is the equivalent of our going to the temple. The Quran is really interesting because it's so similar to the New Testament in that when Muhammad was alive, so let's say the New Testament was Jesus Christ was alive, and when he died, his closest friends wrote down everything that they could remember that he said. The first 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? And so it wasn't written by Jesus Christ. It was a record written by his closest friends trying to preserve his teachings. That's what the Quran is. The Quran is his closest associates, who are called caliphs, the rightly guided caliphs, writing down everything that they could remember that he said when he was alive. And similar to Joseph Smith, Muhammad was not very educated, and he would regularly recite inspiration. He would recite things that he felt inspired to say by God. And I actually make some parallels with Joseph Smith. When Joseph Smith was in the School of the Prophets during the kind of post-Book of Mormon Doctrine and Covenants era, his associates in the School of the Prophets would say that they kind of knew when he was revealing things. He would kind of sit back in his chair, and I think Stephen Harper, who's probably one of my favorite, there's so many, LDS historian. Sorry about this. He said that Joseph Smith would lean back and kind of get into like a little bit of a trance, and then his associates like David Whitmer and Wilford Woodruff, who kept some of the best journals, said Joseph Smith would not speak like himself. This is the Kaaba. This is in the middle of Mecca. This is what everyone, and this is where they will circle as a group. They will pray at the Kaaba, and then they will circle it 7 times, I believe is the number. And if you're not Muslim, you're not allowed to go. You can only go if you're Muslim. And unfortunately, every year there's millions of people who go, and there's always people who die on Hajj. It's such a nightmare. Every year there's like food shortages and water shortages. But this is another reason why the Saudi family is so important, is because they are responsible for protecting the holy city. So the Saudi family, who, by the way that the Saudi Arabian family are connected genetically to Father Abraham, as most Muslims are, is that you have Abraham and Jacob, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You have Jacob's wife, Rachel, and then she was infertile for a while, and so she gave Jacob her handmaid, Bilhah, in order to have, like, as a surrogate, right? As like a surrogate wife. And Bilhah's offspring became what are now the Saudi royal family. That's how they trace their lineage directly to Father Abraham. And their responsibility, their sacred responsibility, is protecting and preserving the holy city of Mecca and providing resources for all of these pilgrims. When you make the pilgrimage to the Hajj, you're called a pilgrim. And that's their responsibility, to provide these services, to protect the city, and also to kind of behave. They need to be perceived by the Middle East and the rest of the Muslim world as kind of behaving above, at a higher standard, because they are in charge of protecting the, this is like the Salt Lake City of the Muslim world. Like, there are so many parallels to the LDS Restoration and like Joseph Smith to Muhammad. I'm going to do a whole class on that. Jared from Christian Homestead and I were going to do that, but the same day that we had it scheduled, there was a pretty, like, I think there was a conflict broke. It was the same day we were going to do it. There was a conflict broke out in Palestine and between Gaza and Israel. And so we wanted to respond to that. So we did a live instead. So I will leave links to all of these documentaries below, and you can start getting a warm up on like what Islam is. You know, I will say, like, you have, like with anything, I guess I would just say, I don't know what your baseline exposure to Muslims and Islam is. It's probably some extreme version. It's probably like you've either seen extreme acts of violence, which are acts. Oh, I've been here. Oh wait, no, the Al-Aqsa Mosque. No, that looks like Turkey. This is the Dome of the Rock. So the Dome of the Rock is an Islamic mosque which was built on top of the temple in Jerusalem. So it's actually like a Muslim mosque on top of a Jewish temple. Kind of interesting. Sorry, I forgot what I was saying. Your exposure to the Middle East is like, if I could say what it's like to be learning about Islam, living in the Muslim world, I would just say the word intense comes to mind. Like, the language is intense, the culture is intense. You're going to see intense versions of like poverty and suffering and violence, but you also will find like the most preserved level of community in the world. And that's one thing that I always loved about, especially when I lived in Morocco. My husband and I contemplated moving to Jordan a couple years ago. One of the things I love about the Middle East is that it is remarkably community oriented, where the rest of the world is so globalized and nobody stays in one place and nobody knows each other. The Middle East has maintained, maybe in part because of the poverty that tends to characterize most of North Africa, the Middle East, and, the Western subcontinent west of India. The poverty is like a character trait but as a result, their relational community ties are so strong. There are versions of Islam that are practiced, like the version of Islam that's practiced in Morocco would not be recognizable to someone from Afghanistan. They are so different. In many ways, Saudi Arabia kind of offers some semblance of standardization for the Muslim world, but for the most part, it does kind of like vary from region to region in some ways. I'm not sure what this is. Okay, so this is just kind of me introducing you to Islam and helping you prepare for the millennium by understanding that, Brad Wilcox talks about how when the second coming comes, when the millennium happens, those of us who are covenant keeping, garment wearing believers are going to need to be his crew. And these are the people that we are going to need to be helping and facilitating and helping. There's going to be a lot of Muslims who recognize the Savior as the Son of God. They will have been prepared by their religion to know that Jesus is the Son of God. Sorry, I wasn't expecting. They will be prepared. They just will have never had the opportunity to know about the gospel because we aren't anywhere in the Middle East. Like that temple map should show you that I showed you. The Muslim world has had almost no opportunity to be exposed to the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. And so there will be an incredible opportunity for us to teach and to preach. Obviously those kinds of things, those exposures are happening in Europe. But once again, like I've had several friends tell me, they had a Muslim friend who was really interested in the gospel and was like, oh my gosh, I totally believe this. But in the end, they couldn't convert because they're like, my family would kill me. That's a very real thing. And I believe there was a point, my mom served her mission in Paris in the early 80s. And if you encountered a Muslim at the time, then you would have to get some kind of approval, like first presidency approval, to have an investigator who was Muslim consider joining the church. Like, it's a pretty rare and big deal. If you know of changes in policy, it's kind of out of my pay grade. I haven't served a mission where I would have encountered that. Please leave a comment below. I would love any comments or questions that you have about the Middle East as it relates to an LDS perspective. I met some really cool people at the conference I was at last week in Utah's Book of Mormon Evidence Conference, and we had such really, honestly cathartic, but really great conversations about Islam and Muslims, and they gave me a lot of questions that I realized could be addressed and that we could start preparing for the millennium in a more proactive way, knowing that basically, like, I don't want to say half the population of the world, but it's less than a half and more than a third of the global population of the world are Muslim. So there's a real need for us to prepare for that reality. And I'm happy to prepare and answer any kind of questions for you that will help you understand the paradigm of the Muslim faith. Subscribe, please. I am so excited that I broke 5,000, and that was a big deal for me to have this channel grow. My entire objective here is to elevate our understanding of priesthood power in our lives with men and women. From a female perspective, I feel so lucky to be a woman in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I in no way feel disenfranchised as a woman. If anything, I feel like this is the last corner of the modern world where I am allowed to be a woman and where my status as an eternal mother is protected. And so I know there's a lot of criticism by sometimes women in the church who say that our religion is sexist, and I just do not agree. I think that the priesthood power we've been given through covenants is there to preserve and protect our posterity, and I think that we are being blessed with that, and we're seeing a fruition of that, a fulfillment of that, and it's going to be an exciting but crazy few years. So like and subscribe, and thanks for being here. Bye.
How I yearn for you to understand that the restoration of the priesthood is just as relevant to you as a woman as it is to any man. Because the Melchizedek priesthood has been restored, both covenant-keeping women and men have access to all the spiritual blessings of the church. The heavens are just as open to women who are endowed with God's power, that power flowing from their priesthood covenants, as there are to men who bear the priesthood.